We are now recording. All right, welcome everybody to our webinar today. We have an action-packed discussion for you. The topic is getting to a fit for the future operating model, asking the right questions. And I think it's all right there in the title. How are you getting fit for purpose? What does that mean for your operating model? And most importantly, what are the questions we should be asking to make sure that we're even getting into the right place? My name is Kim Kaczynskis. I am a technical director at Humentum. Happy to kick us off with some housekeeping. So the first thing to know is that there should be closed captioning if you should need it. There is also the chat option. This is a 1-hour webinar. Please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and then also put your questions in the chat as we go along. And our moderator, Chris, will keep an eye on it, and myself and my colleague, Aisha, will also be keeping an eye on the chat as we go along. The impetus for this webinar was the release of Humentum's organizational transformation guide. And I'll go ahead and put the link into the chat for you in case you have not seen it. This guide was the product of much co-creation in 2024. It was the co-creation of the Time Initiative and a Humentum working group that was looking at organizational models. And in the beginning of 2025, we realized that the needs were continuing to evolve, and maybe organizations were not just looking at pivoting, but they might be looking at consolidation as well. And so we continued to add and adjust. This is very much intended to be a living document. We reserve the right to adjust and change as we continue to learn, and we encourage you to download it in its Word format so that you can adjust and make it work for your organization. We're going to talk a little bit about the guide today, but mostly we're going to try and bring it to life through real life experience. So we've invited a few folks to come along who have experience with some of the different options that are presented in the guide to talk about what they've done, how it worked, maybe how it didn't work, what questions they had to ask along the way. So I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, co-CEO of Humentum, Chris Proulx. And Chris, over to you.
Great, Kim. Thanks so much for that great introduction, and welcome everybody. I'm glad to see people still kind of coming in. And I'm anticipating a pretty energizing and robust kind of conversation today. And there's, certainly been no shortage of digital ink spilled in the last couple of months around what really are the models kind of for NGOs going forward. Should a lot of INGOs be closing? Should there be a lot of mergers? And, I think what was really timely is that Kim and her colleagues were really working on a lot of these discussions before we really were in a much larger sort of crisis mode, but looking at it through a much broader lens of saying, like, it's not just about, mergers, which is the easiest thing sometimes for people to grab onto, but that there are a lot of other ways you can look at what you're doing strategically and structurally, and how you can partner and align with other organizations through a whole range of models. And so the goal of the org transformation guide was really to try to kind of put that broader palette and canvas of things together, so that NGO leaders had a variety of choices to kind of work from and to kind of work with their teams through a facilitated process. So I'm really excited today because we have, I think Pauline has joined. So 3 leaders who have gone through a range of these different kinds of transformations. And we're gonna have a chance to kind of learn from each of them about some of the criteria that they use, some of the successes, some of the challenges, but more importantly then, how are those use cases relevant to the NGO leaders who are trying to make really hard decisions in this moment. So we have Karl Hoffmann, CEO of HealthX Partners, which is, and he'll explain a little bit more about that, kind of came through a collaboration between PSI and Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Fund, and did that without stumbling. We have Pauline Wambeti, the Managing Director of Nuru Kenya. Pauline is traveling and on assignment right now, and so might only join us on audio, but hopefully you're here, Pauline, and if you are, give us a thumbs up or a comment in the chat. And she's going to talk a lot about a lot of local transitioning and the journey that Nuru has been on and is still actively involved in their transition to local community engagement. And then Natasha Sakolsky, most recently from Pathfinder, but has held a variety of senior leadership roles in a number of global health INGOs, and therefore has been in this seat multiple times, looking at strategy and structural changes and a whole range of different approaches. So we're going to have a chance to, I think, cover a pretty broad range. Karl, I'll start with you. Certainly give us a little bit more of a maybe just bio for yourself, and then feel free to like dig in right from the start on what were some of the maybe drivers that led your leadership teams to look at the HealthX concept. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. And thank you to Humentum for organizing this conversation. I don't think there's any NGO that isn't wrestling with these topics right now, so it's very timely. And also, I have to say that I think the guide that Humentum has put out is really a very useful and practical one. It's not going to sit on your shelf, you're going to use it. Full disclosure, I mean, I was part of the Time Initiative, which, as Kim said at the outset, was part of the, I think, origin of what's distilled into this guide. But it's really valuable to see it all in one place, sort of recommendations and things to watch out for. So yes, as you mentioned, I'm Karl Hoffmann. I'm the CEO of HealthX Partners, which is a newly created joint enterprise that was co-created by PSI, Population Services International, and EGPAF, the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation. HealthX Partners came into being on January 1st, but was in gestation, I would say, for about a year. We started about a year ago in the late winter, early spring of 2024 to bring this concept into life. It's not a merger, although sometimes people will talk about it in those terms, and it has some aspects that might seem familiar to those of you who've considered mergers. Instead, it was the co-creation of a parent company meant to be a structure above, but supportive of PSI and EGPAF and other organizations that eventually join this group. And I think that's an important point. In a merger, and mergers, let's be honest, are really hard in the nonprofit context. And Natasha knows this well from having, I think, swum in these waters for a long time. Like, many people talk about it. It's very hard to bring across the finish line for a lot of different reasons, and we can discuss some of those. PSI and EGPAF had been thinking about a merger, but we pretty quickly encountered some of those obstacles, which involve emotional concepts like identity and brand and mission and history and things that are in the private sector, I think, get addressed through the application of money, but which in the nonprofit sector don't lend themselves to that sort of solution. So that was proving to be a difficult conversation. And then we hit upon this idea of a parent company structure, a holding company structure. And the beauty of it is allows PSI and EGPAF to continue to exist with their own leaders, Michael Holscher from PSI, Doris Macharia from EGPAF, and their own boards and their own 501c3s and their own presence in the marketplace and identity. But part of a holding company structure that offers what? Strategic alignment and the ability to consolidate support functions so that both those organizations can put more money toward their impact and less money toward running the enterprise. And that is the journey that HealthX Partners is on now, and I'm happy to talk about any aspect of that, but and sort of other elements that brought this into formation for us. But let me just highlight two before maybe I'll turn it back to you, Chris, and that is one. I was the CEO of PSI for many years, and my counterpart, Chip Lyons, was CEO and president of EGPAF for many years. Chip knew that he would be retiring at the beginning of the year, and so that's a factor that played into conversations about leadership, right? In a positive way, I think. We knew there was going to be a shifting leadership landscape for both organizations, potentially. And also we had boards. Both PSI and EGPAF's boards, I think for a long time, have been prepared for the reality that many organizations in this space are encountering and that all CEOs know. And I'm talking about the global health space. Let me be precise on that. That 25 years of escalating funding is behind us now. We're in a period of flat or declining funding from a lot of these traditional sources. the pressure is on all organizations to find more efficiency, to deliver more health for the money, and to think about consolidation. So our boards were already in the mindset that was susceptible to a conversation around this sort of partnership. And critically, we had 2 board chairs from EGPAF and PSI with private sector backgrounds who had experience in M&A and holding company concepts. And for them, this made logical sense. So you had leadership alignment, you had board readiness, and you had board chair commitment. And those elements were really important to push this idea across the starting point, the starting line. Now, actually building this concept is hard, and we're in the midst of it right now. I'm happy to talk about any aspect of that, but that's sort of how we got here with HealthX Partners.
Okay, thanks, Karl. That was a great background, and I think we will get into at some point, like, yeah, the challenges of living within HealthX Partners right now. It was useful to hear about the board chairs and the board alignment, because one of the questions I was going to have for you, and I'll still give it to you and just double click on it a little bit if you want to, which is, right, like what was the magic moment where you were able to transition from this idea of a very kind of traditional merger concept, which you were running into resistance to, and did the idea come from your board chairs? Did the idea come from attorneys? Like, where did the idea of this, wait, there's another way to architect this come from?
Yeah, I have to give credit. It came from one of the board chairs. And those 2 board chairs are now the co-chairs of HealthX Partners. So there's a parent company board that oversees the whole enterprise. And it was one of the co-chairs who said, the merger conversation, we can see the headaches. What about a holding company? What about a parent company? And then we began to run that string out, and we saw a lot of advantages to it. I mean, as I alluded to or mentioned, one of those is that it's not a limiting concept. I think a merger is inherently limiting. There are 2 or maybe 3. I mean, Humentum's a product of a merger, right? And you probably have stories to tell about how difficult or fulfilling that was. And you took those 3 entities, and there's a new entity that emerged on the other side of that. The beauty of the holding company concept for us was neither PSI nor EGPAF really wanted to sunset, didn't see the time had come to sunset. The missions are unfulfilled, the work is still fulfilling and important. And the identity and the market presence and the brand equity is strong. A merger felt like a way in which one of those was going to suffer. One organization was going to suffer more than the other. The parent company was a way to say, no, let's create a structure that allows both organizations to thrive. Now, words like thrive, you don't throw around lightly in this moment of 2025, right? Given everything that's happening in our sector. That was the 2024 language. You might replace that with survive as opposed to thrive right now. But that was the idea, right? Let both of the organizations still be in the sunlight and just have a supporting structure that allows them to, as I said, put more money toward the impact, less money toward the cost of delivering it.
Great. And maybe just a closing question, then I'll move to you, Natasha, is in terms of how it's conceptualized right now, what services are you currently or aspiring for HealthX Partners to deliver to at least these 2 organizations and maybe others in the future if others buy into the concept?
Yes, I should say there's also a 3rd organization that's becoming part of the group called Via Health Foundation, which was a part of PSI and is now moving to be an independent part of HealthX Partners. So it's already growing. The group is already growing, and we're satisfied about that. So the support infrastructure that we're talking about consolidating are the conventional pieces. You're talking about HR, IT, finance, internal audit, the management of procurement activities. Sometimes that's called back office. I think some people bristle at that term. Sometimes it's called support functions. We've come to call it the infrastructure part of PSI and EGPAF. How can we consolidate that, make it more efficient, more cost effective? We're already doing that. There are already savings that both organizations have realized by consolidating at leadership levels, and we're now moving down methodically to consolidate the functions more substantially. We're convinced we're going to deliver savings to the organizations. And the challenge now is to ensure that we deliver also high quality services to those organizations through this shared services concept. And that's what we're about right now.
Great. All right. Thank you. So Natasha, you have been involved in a number of different types of transformations, and in some ways been in the sausage making that Karl's about ready to, or now entering into, right? So I don't know if you want to first just give a brief little synopsis for folks of the different types of situations and organizations where that occurred, and then maybe we can take one or two and drill in a little bit.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And also thank you for hosting this webinar and the timeliness of it and the guide. I will say I've read through it. I have notes scribbled all over it. And in each of these examples could have very much benefited from having had that guide at the time. I'll offer 4 examples of operating structure transformations that I've been a part of. Karl, if you think 2024 is a long time ago, going back to 2010, 2011. AED, for those who have been around the block, the Academy for Educational Development, had been suspended from receiving USAID and US government funding more broadly, and was absolutely in a moment of crisis, financial and otherwise, in terms of continuing its good work in the US and around the world. Simultaneously, FHI, Family Health International, had been looking at how to broaden its scope and its work beyond global health to 360, to be integrated and include education, environment, democracy and governance and other functions. So the opportunity was there. And because FHI had also had some smart business practices and investments in terms of a foundation, a clinical research organization. There were resources to acquire the assets and expertise of AED. So, not to jump into lessons learned too quickly, but it was an acquisition and not a merger. And I think one of the things that we perhaps could have done differently is really acknowledge that up front, as opposed to approaching it like a merger when it wasn't. I think NGOs, nonprofits generally tend to be very nice organizations and very conflict avoidant. We'd all just been immersing ourselves in business practices from the private sector that didn't quite look and feel right. And so it was a natural instinct to approach it as a merger when in fact it was an acquisition. So I came in, I believe I was the first official employee of FHI 360 and came in to lead the strategy, structure, organizational design, and change management work. Fast forwarding to my most recent experience with Pathfinder International, that is an organization that has decided to iterate on its operating structure and operating model. This work really took off meaningfully 2021, 2022 under the leadership of our CEO. And the strategy was to make Pathfinder more country-led. And so that, as you can imagine, was very much undergirded by momentum in localization, decolonization, power shifting, and really enabled shifts in operating functions, HR, contracts and grants, security, IT, etc., to the countries where Pathfinder works under the leadership of representatives also in those countries where Pathfinder works. So I came in as the first chief of global services there to help shepherd some of those shifts through. In between FHI 360 and Pathfinder, to note, in case it's useful to this conversation, I also had the opportunity to lead PACT Institute, which was a wholly owned subsidiary of PACT, another INGO in the space. Again, health certainly, but broader than health as well, looking at supply chains, mining, governance, democracy and governance, and so on. PACT Institute, as a subsidiary, was responsible for corporate foundation, multilateral and non-US government bilateral partnerships. It had existed for quite some time when I had arrived. And after my 4 to 5 years in that role, there were shifts in organizational leadership. There was new examination of data and trade-offs in how financial resources were being deployed in the organization. And ultimately, a decision was made, I had facilitated a decision to sunset Pact Institute, that it didn't seem needed, and that the costs and the management burden of the subsidiary were not of value in return on investment. Subsequently, Pact Ventures, which was the impact investing arm, and Pact UK also sunset at Pact. So some experience there in sunsetting. And then I was reflecting in preparation for this webinar on time I spent as the US Director for Frontline AIDS, which at the time was the International HIV/AIDS Alliance. It's a UK-based charity, global charity. It's a networked model, and always has been, even back then, which was probably about 10, 15 years ago now. Frontline AIDS was very interested in having a Washington, DC presence to focus on fundraising and policy, yet wanted it to be very lean and affordable. There was a Dutch INGO, Stop AIDS Alliance, which was also interested in having a Washington, DC presence, focused on policy, particularly multilateral influence and policy. And so a strategic partnership was formed. And it was, in fact, a very lean 3, 4, 5-person team of the two organizations here in Washington, DC. And I had the pleasure to launch and lead that.
Okay, so you have basically a number of tools that you could be deploying right now across a variety of NGO circumstances. So first I'm going to ask you a targeted question, but then I'm going to zoom out to a broader question. So the targeted question first is, using your experience at AED, like there's been a lot of discussion around how NGOs right now need to be thinking about it in a more of an acquisition standpoint, right? And maybe it's a whole organization being acquired, or maybe there's certain assets, certain country programs, certain contracts that an organization would be better off actually exiting those commitments and finding someone to acquire them, right? And so if you're that leader right now and you're on either side of that transaction, thinking about, okay, I'm in a buy mode because I've got resources and I could be taking advantage of this moment, to use very crass terms about it, or I'm in a sell mode, which is really, I've got some assets that could risk being stranded if I don't find them a logical home. Like, what would be like one or two like kind of critical questions you would think that those leaders really should be asking, or a red flag or something? Because I think there are a lot of people sort of thinking through those exact scenarios. And I heard you say it was really important to kind of call it out as what it is, but maybe you could kind of say if there are a couple other things, lessons learned from that experience at AED and FHI.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And Karl alluded to some of these things earlier when he spoke as well. But I think, one of the things that doesn't get as much attention within organizations when we're thinking through opportunities for operating model design is, first and foremost, board and sort of board interest and comfort in change, first and foremost, messiness, risk. Karl, the fact that you had such strength in both boards, Elizabeth Glazier and PSI, I think can't be understated. So I think that's something to probe very seriously. Similarly, the strength of organizations, both the acquiring organization and the potentially to be acquired organization. To be the acquiring organization, you really do need to be stable, as much as an organization can be in this current environment. FHI, back in 2010, 2011, was an incredibly stable organization that had just completed what many INGOs in our space had in becoming one FHI, really taking different institutes and sort of pulling them together at the country level, taking different project offices and pulling them together under country leadership. And so really making sure as the acquiring organization that you have that strength. As an acquiree, I think that's a word, being clear what you are able to give up and comfortable giving up, because there is some letting go that needs to happen. And that could happen in terms of control and decision making as leadership teams become integrated. It could be in terms of business lines There could be certain areas that an organization holds dear from a legacy perspective, but might not serve the organization, the combined organization in the future, right? And so really also being data driven. I think a lot of times these decisions, it's all emotional. I'm glad you talked about that, Karl. But a lot of these decisions can be made based on what people want or what people hope. And it's really always good to get the numbers out. CFOs have to be very involved and, you know, really running different scenarios on either end. I also think brand is important, and, you know, sort of testing the waters on that on both sides. And then in this current environment, you know, really looking at donor diversification. If you were two INGOs or NGOs that heavily relied on USAID funding and now you want to come together, I think you have to be realistic about really what that could offer or not in the future. And so really looking at a diversified funding base, work with private sector, corporate partners, and so on is important.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, it's, you know, clearly board is one thread that has come through really strongly here in terms of like their engagement early and their support and leadership. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that before the end. Maybe now kind of that broader question, right? You know, because you've got experience with a whole variety of different kinds of transformational tools, and if a leader has the luxury right now, sort of thinking across a broad palette, how might you think about assessing which kind of different models are more appropriate, rather than starting with one and then trying to assess that one, but rather how do you kind of sit where you are right now and kind of say, right, okay, sunset, strategic partnership, consolidation, merger, holding company, like how would a leadership team kind of methodically go through that process?
Early, I think they would go through it early, ideally, is what I would first advise and what I would first consider as a member of a leadership team. You don't want to wait until you're in financial crisis or until you're looking at closure to figure out what's next. Even before this moment, even before your numbers start to shrink, start to decline, you should be having conversations and you should be exploring opportunities with other organizations through conversation. Doesn't mean that you're going to merge, doesn't mean you're going to have a strategic partnership. It doesn't mean that you are looking to be acquired, but you're keeping your options open. I think thinking through how to achieve your mission and keep your mission viable, as it sounds like was the case for both PSI and EggPath, is the priority. So as much as leadership teams, boards of directors can put the business's best interest at heart in having those exploratory conversations, they should along the way. So I would advise that early and often.
Excellent. Thanks, Natasha. So I want to check, Pauline, I know you're here. Are you able to position to unmute so that we can shift to you? If you are, just go ahead and unmute.
Yes, I'm here.
Beautiful. Yeah, and we hear you quite well, Pauline. So thank you again. I did a little intro. I'm not sure you were here. So Pauline Wambeti is the managing director of Nuru Kenya and is traveling right now for work. So thanks, Pauline, for joining while you're traveling. I appreciate it. So do you want to take a bit of time here and just give people a sense of the journey that Nuru Kenya has been on? And then maybe we can then talk about a couple of the key questions about the specific transition you're in right now, but maybe give us the bigger story.
Okay, so Nuru Kenya is a local organization that was founded in 2008. And it took many shapes all the way to 2010 when it became an ungovernmental organization. Basically, it was expatriate-led. So the founders are the ones who came to Kenya, identified the area where they want to start working, and then they started implementing the activities of extreme poverty reduction themselves. And so some years down the line, that was in 2013, they had expected the transition, the organization from being expatriate-led to locally led. Unfortunately, that timeline did not work for them. And so the transition happened in 2015. So when we started the transition, there was a lot of changes that we faced and a lot of challenges that we also came across. But we were happy we were able to overcome that. We learned a lot of lessons. We became also part of a research and case study that was going on, the Stopping a Success case study. And that's how we were able to even monitor the transition that was happening in the organization. So it was a phased approach with a lot of lessons that we learned. So today we are now also continuing to transition our interventions to the local community. So it's not just a local team that was assembled driving the intervention, but for sustainability, it is now the communities owning the intervention and continuing with it. And especially because now our resources have really dwindled. We are facing now those limited resources, and we want to fast track the sustainability aspect. And so we found ourselves going back again to the drawing board to plan much better how to transition some of the things the communities can do, let them do it themselves. And then for us, we are able to focus on other things as we also figure out our sustainability as an organization, what the new funding changes mean for us. Which partners do we bring into our space so that we are able to achieve our objectives?
Excellent, Pauline. Thank you so much. And I think it's quite relevant. I know we have a lot of representatives of local organizations on the webinar today as well. And so maybe you just kind of give us a little bit more detail of the kinds of decisions and the kinds of accountabilities you're transitioning directly to the communities. And what is that relationship now going to look like between Nuru Kenya and the communities once you're successfully transitioned those?
Okay, so just to run you through what the critical questions we keep asking ourselves, we started asking ourselves at that time during the initial transition, and we continue to do that even now. What do you want to achieve? Because when transition must happen, that means the change is inevitable and there is that risk for mission creep. So we have to really continue reminding ourselves why we exist. What's our vision? What's our mission? Why are we doing what we are doing with the communities? What plan do we have? And then we look at how are we going to implement this plan? What do we need? Who is qualified to do it? What do we need to prepare? Because we need to prepare. What do we need to learn? What do we need to unlearn? We realized there are things we needed to unlearn. I even remember at one point our founder making us write on the wall in paint, the most dangerous face in the language. The quote by Grace Hopper is, we've always done it this way, because we needed to really change our mindset. And we needed to be ready and receptive. It was a moment, at times of uncertainty. We had a lot of insecurities, and we were really not prepared for what happened. It was a tumultuous time, and we ended up even going through attrition because ideologies and some of the commitment levels and the values of people did not align. And so it was a very challenging time when we were transitioning the first time. So we had some readiness surveys that we did for staff. We looked at we did surveys for the staff to gauge their capacity, the levels of readiness. And then we also did client satisfaction surveys with the community. And that's when we realized even them, they were feeling the insecurity we were feeling as staff. They were losing trust. They felt shortchanged. They didn't trust that a local team will even deliver what the donor was doing. The community also felt they were not competent to even own or take responsibility in the intervention. So we learned a lot when we did these surveys. And then even at some point, we thought we were really doing things well, communicating to them that the donor is finally leaving Kenya, and this will be locally led. So you'll be interacting with people who are speaking your language, who understand issues better. But when we thought that would maybe give them some security, but it was creating anxiety. And at some point, we also realized we had gaps in our communication. So it was a moment of a lot of learning a lot, receiving a lot of feedback, most of it what we didn't expect. And then we realized we have now to work harder to gain trust. We have to also internally, evaluate ourselves. We have to allow ourselves to be vulnerable, put ourselves out there to be held accountable by the community, by the government ministries that we are working with, and also now be ready to communicate the challenges we're experiencing from the donors so that they can support us. We realized even the expertise that they had was different from ours. We have to change some of the software that they were using were no longer applicable for us, or we were not able even to comprehend. So a lot of things, we really had to be honest with ourselves, be very transparent and say, this will work, this will not work. So how did we balance all that? We managed to sit in have dialogue sessions with the stakeholders and just talk through things and figure out how to be innovative and creative to address the challenges we experience. We had to invest in capacity building. We had to do exposure visits. We had to tell ourselves we need to relinquish control. That was the most difficult thing. Relinquishing control of the processes and decisions that we were making before. And we realized when we did that, it was a gradual process in incremental phases. And that's when we realized that our attention was needed elsewhere. So we just decided to be elaborate, to establish appropriate mechanisms and systems that will anchor the change we were driving. And then we build from the ground up. We don't have to imagine that it is something that will be done overnight, or we have a solution to everything. So we also had to be ready to iterate. We went into many sessions of planning, but then at some point, not all the plans were working. So we needed to be ready to iterate along the way and then be able to have a focal point. And our focal point was the local context. We just need to come from local and move on. So having that right attitude, that despite the uncertainty, we need to be receptive, we need to be creative and innovative, we need to invest in capacity building, and we need to ensure we relinquish the control of the processes and decision making.
Yeah, I suspect there's a lot of people hearing you say relinquish control and decision making, and they're getting a little pit in their stomach. But let me ask you, there's a question here in chat, which you may or may not have seen, Pauline, from Nelson, which is, was the desire for this transition of decision-making and accountability to the community, did that come from the community itself, or was that a vision of Nuru that you were trying to execute and bring the community along? So where was the kind of driver, I guess, is the question.
I would say it was both. Initially, it was us driving the process, but then the community now started taking it up because now we are bringing to them change. Things are going to be done differently by different people. And so they wanted now for us to have those avenues for them to communicate to us, whether we are really achieving our goals and doing what we set out to do. Because for them, the change was very drastic. Because you see, these were expatriates who are living alongside them and doing things alongside them. And when they encounter challenges or those financial, economic shocks, climate issues, the founders were there with them to resolve those issues. Now they are no longer within reach. And so they needed to know, the local team, how will they hold them accountable? Will they listen? Will they understand? And will they be able to work out solutions together with them. So are their priorities changing? And now that you've transitioned to us as the community, are you abandoning us? You know? So those are it now became a two-way process, and we've continued now as we scale our model, we've continued to encounter the need for this. And we are realizing in 2025, things are even tougher because now with reduced funding, the community is becoming more worried and anxious, and that now they are really more involved, which is a good thing. They are more involved. They are now realizing they need to take responsibility and invest and not just wait for the organization to do the investment for them. And so even in the new areas, we are seeing the farmers are more receptive to the change. What they want is a very transparent partner working alongside them, will tell them, we are not able to deliver this. How can we figure it out? Instead of them being surprised along the way. So they want us to be able to plan ahead and think things through with them.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to pick up on a thread that Pauline introduced, and I want to actually come back to both Natasha and Karl, which is the role of the donor. So in the transformations you both have been a part of, were you at different points in time engaging your donor in these conversations? Were they part of helping you think this through? Did they try to help you fund these transitions? So I want to come back to you, Natasha, and then we'll go over to Karl with a question about donors.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think the case of FHI 360, the acquisition of the AED assets and expertise, the donor was absolutely involved. I mean, it was a very close communication and coordination with USAID. It had to be. And so that was a little bit different in terms of how these things might happen. I would assume in a program transfer, for example, that's also something that would involve a very high touch communication with donors. What I have found in my experience, whether it was with the sunsetting of PACT Institute or the creation of the Frontline AIDS DC office, with Stop AIDS Alliance, even with Pathfinder International and the embarking upon the country-led strategy, internally, staff will make a lot of assumptions about what donors want or don't want, and that can gain some momentum without being vetted, right? Where you're not really checking to see if that's truly the case. Even in the case of Legacy FHI or FHI 360, when we were combining country offices across Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world, people would say, well, this isn't what the donor wants. The donor, you know, and often it's because that person themselves may not be comfortable with change, may not want to see the change, and may consciously or even unconsciously be putting up roadblocks to that change. When in fact, having open conversation with the funder, you find that either they don't think it's their business, it's your organization to lead and manage with your board as you see fit, or they're very supportive and in some cases very excited, particularly with Pathfinder's country-led strategy, traveling around the world and talking to donors. It was very much welcome and people were very excited to see that this was happening. So, you know, how that plays out in terms of money and return, I think is still to be seen in the case of Pathfinder. For PACT Institute and the sunsetting, we had a portfolio of corporate and foundation funders that were unfazed by the sunsetting of PACT Institute, that essentially what we had built up in our mind as a need to have this separate entity really came down to a cost accounting issue on the back end and how we were both managing costs and then, you know, communicating with donors as needed or if questions were to arise. So I think the question of donor is a good one. I think sometimes it is an outsized one depending on where it's coming from. And generally, I have only seen donor support for new operating models and new structures.
Great, thanks. Karl, what about in your experience in building HealthX partners? Were the donors part of the equation?
Yeah, those are great observations from Natasha. I mean, I would say not really. We did reach out to key donors when we got to certain decision points to sort of let them know we're not asking permission. As Natasha said, these are decisions that organizations have to make about their own futures. But we wanted key funding partners to know what we were doing. I have to say the reaction was pretty much kind of silence. There's one big exception. There's one key funder that was very excited about the model and is on the verge of making a donation to support the transformation process. So that's really welcome, right? But for the most part, donors took note, might have had some vaguely positive things to say, but it wasn't a big determining factor. And let's be honest, we can all imagine, many of us on this call have been part of 20 or 30 years of saying, well, we have to be careful what USAID wants or doesn't want. What does that matter now? Very little. So we have to be cautious about putting too much stock in what the donor may want or what we think the donor may want, and instead doing what we know the organization needs or the work needs, and proceeding on that path.
Great, thank you. So Pauline, I'm going to come back to you now. Double checking you're still there. Yes, you are. So if you were leading an INGO and you wanted to use this moment in the funding crisis and so on to actually really accelerate plans to give more local control and do more locally led structure, what recommendation would you give to the leaders of those INGOs to really help them accelerate their transition?
Okay. I would first start by urging them to bring the local teams on the decision-making table. Because yes, we know the paper calls the tune. You have the resources and there is what you want to achieve when you are a donor. But then how to go about it needs to be a well thought out process. It's never, it should not be cast on stone, because I've worked in projects where everything is prescribed. Let's do it this way within this timeline and bring in this number and all that. But what I've realized is the development facilitators and communities are now actively engaged in conversations about sustainability. And the development facilitators also want to be careful not to strip the communities they're working with of their dignity, because it creates dependency. So when a community feels that things will be done for them, then it no longer becomes a sustainable approach. And there's a tendency to imagine that there is going to be wastage and of time and resources when we bring in key stakeholders on the table. And sometimes we can also get our stakeholders wrong. That's what we've learned along the way, because our priorities are different. And so being able to bring in the people who are affected, especially the community itself, on the decision-making table so that they can be able to map out their journey. It's their journey of development. It's their journey of resolving bringing solutions to the issues they are facing. So it should be their word that is put as a top priority. And then being flexible and being ready to unlearn some things and learn others. So when you're flexible, you'll be able to change some of the things you thought were good so that you can be able to include the perspectives of the community that you're supporting. So those are the things I found, because when our donor listened, we actually ended up saving money that was used elsewhere, as opposed to maintaining the structures that were there when they were on the ground. So when you are able to listen to new perspectives, then you are able even to save time and money, and you're able to achieve more. So I would say that is the key thing. Just relinquish that control, making decisions for the people you are targeting.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Pauline. So I'm going to come around to Karl and Natasha each for one more question. So for Karl, there's a lot of organizations also thinking about shared services models right now for the exact reasons you articulated it, right? Being able to find a leaner way to operate and some more efficiencies. If you were having to start this process though now in the current context, as opposed to having the luxury of starting it 12 months ago, is there something that would be different? Is there some piece of advice that would help those teams sort of think about how to establish what you've done in this perhaps more urgent situation?
Well, I think the only thing we would do differently is go faster, right? I mean, we've often said if we hadn't had that 12 months working on this already, we'd be desperately trying to ramp it up right now, because to us, the sort of approach that we're taking toward consolidation and efficiency and cost effectiveness to be able to put more resources toward mission is just an imperative right now. It might have been an option in the past. Now it's an imperative because the donor landscape has so dramatically shifted. I mean, it is a painful moment, I know, for many organizations and for people who we treasure, who have worked for decades in this field and who now no longer find themselves with a job or the job that they thought they might have. So it's wasteful and destructive. But on the other side of it, there is a future that is arguably more rational, where some of what Pauline's been talking about is possible. There's less of a power dynamic that dominates, where the donor calls all the shots and communities may be calling more shots, and organizations, there may be fewer of them, but they may be more efficient. There's more rationality in the system. All of us have rethought how we need to structure ourselves for greater independence and driven our operating model in that direction. That's kind of the hopeful vision for the other side of the current disruptive and destructive reality we're living through. And I think it's possible. And so would we do anything differently? No, except I think we would try and go faster in the journey that we're on now.
Yeah, thank you. And I was impressed already with how fast, I mean, you were able to do it essentially less than 12 months from kind of start to at least getting it stood up. From our own experience in Humentum, it took longer to get from what I thought was a pretty well-aligned board and leadership team at the start to getting to an actually organization stood up. But I think that again points the difference between merger and what you did, right? Is you were actually creating a new thing over here that then had a relationship to these other entities rather than trying to consolidate these existing entities. Yeah, and Mira also commenting here that 1 year seems quite impressive. So you perhaps are setting some land speed records and kudos for that. Natasha, the question I want to ask you, because you've had so many different kinds of experiences, is how do you keep everyone going through the pockets and periods of resistance when it just seems like there's just like a death by a million cuts is keeping this thing from succeeding? And from a change management point of view, how do you sustain and keep everybody going?
Well, surely it isn't one thing. Yet if I had to just highlight one, I would say really staying connected to the why of the change, the why of the transformation. And that why can take various forms, various shapes. It can be why in terms of the change in the world, why of the change for a community, for a population, why a change for the company, right? As Karl's alluding to, and as Pauline is alluding to as well, even change for a team or a change for an individual, just being able to really connect to that why. And so one of the things that we did at FHI 360 was, first of all, on the front end, brought all of our leaders together, executive senior leaders together to co-create the strategy for the new organization, to co-design the new operating structure, looking at various scenarios and the pros and cons of those various scenarios. And I think getting that ownership, that buy-in early across leadership is important for leaders, but then also for their teams as they cascade their understanding and their why. And so we had leaders craft in their own voice, as relevant to their own person, team, and work, why the change is happening. And it's very much aligned to mission, as you would imagine, to purpose. And I think that keeps people coming back. Even in moments of resistance at Pathfinder, we were shifting staff positions from the US to countries around the world. We were shifting indirect and unrestricted resources from the US to countries around the world. But being able to articulate why and help colleagues, even those who were being let go, perhaps because of an elimination in their role, they got it. They were supportive, not always, looking forward to what comes next for them personally, but from a bigger picture perspective in terms of the change they wanted to see in the world, the change they wanted to see in the organization, they were on board. So I think staying connected to that why, that purpose.
Yeah, excellent. I want to reflect on two things, maybe from my own perspective, from the Humentum piece. One is in response to what Pauline pointed out here. So Pauline just pointed out in chat that for Nuru, that meant obviously some attrition. And I think you mean staff attrition here. But that some of those same people have stayed engaged, but yet in different roles. And I think that's also key, like helping people see a kind of a broader palette of ways in which they can stay engaged. And I know for us at Humentum, that was also key. Some of the staff who were here at the time are still involved with Humentum in a number of different ways. They're just not in a staff role anymore. And so I think, kind of having that sense of how you transition individuals as well as how you transition the organization, I think is really important. And we could have done a better job from the beginning on that. And then the second is for those of you worried about doing things in a period of turbulence and crisis, I think, we were about 2 years into the operationalization of our merger when the COVID pandemic hit. And I think for us, it's actually what synced it all together. Like suddenly the value of 1 + 1 + 1 being greater really showed up in that moment, and how we could respond to the COVID pandemic for the sector and with the sector. And so in that sense, like using this moment, and it's, I think all three of you have spoken, in different ways too, I think is really powerful. We're pretty close to closing. I'm going to toss it back to my colleague Kim just for sort of any wrap up sort of thoughts. I want to thank again Karl and Pauline and Natasha for a really robust kind of conversation. It was really great to actually really have like 3 very different experiences and different perspectives on what transformation looks like, to, I think, reinforce the point is there is no one size fits all, but there are some, what is that whole thing about something harmonizing? I'm now losing it, the metaphor, right? But there are some things that hopefully you can take bits and pieces of, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel, even though you should hopefully recognize from this conversation that there's a lot of diversity of ways of approaching it. So thank you all for sharing your experiences. And Kim, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks. Yes. Thank you all. Thank you for joining. Thank you to those on our panel who volunteered their time to speak and share your experience. Yet diversity of experiences, and yet common themes that I heard were asking the critical questions, the importance of leadership, alignment, the importance of boards, the importance of letting go of control and being open to listening. So I'm going to put a few links in the chat as follow-up, and you'll also receive the recording and these links in a follow-up email in the coming days. The Organizational Transformation Guide has been co-created through Humentum with our key constituencies. It's free. Download it, make it work for you, use it. If you find that you need support and help, there's also a link for Humentum's support services to help you do that, whether that is accompanying you to use the guide or to take pieces of the work that you already know need to happen and put it into action and to implement it. So do reach out and let us know how we can help. And then finally, sign up to the newsletter to get all of the information, whether that is communities of practice, roundtables, thought leadership, more resources, more support services. If you're not already on there, please make sure you do so. Stay tuned for the follow-up email. We will be in touch, and I hope to see you at the next one. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.